I woke to the roar of chainsaws, not the far-off buzz of construction. These were practically beneath my bedroom window. Half asleep, I staggered onto the porch in my pajamas and saw 4 workers hacking apart the oak trees my late wife cherished. The same trees that had sheltered our home for 4 decades. Standing nearby, giving orders from behind the wheel of her white Escalade, was Constance Peton, our HOA president. She was grinning. What she didn't realize was this: those oaks were planted on my land, not community property, and by cutting them down, she had just triggered a disaster that would unravel everything she owned. That careless act opened the door to an investigation that exposed 3 years' worth of fraud, stolen money, and one of the biggest real estate rackets I'd ever witnessed. So tell me, what would you do if your HOA wiped out $50,000 worth of trees, all to improve someone else's view? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let me know where you're tuning in from. Because what started as an illegal chainsaw stunt ended with a $1.4 million judgment that put me in charge of her entire neighborhood. Just 3 years earlier, I thought I had discovered my little piece of heaven. My name's Garrett Blackwood, 52, a recently retired electrical engineer. I had just bought what I believed was my dream home in Millbrook Estates, Ohio. A corner property sitting on 1.2 acres with 6 towering oaks that had been growing strong since the 1880s. My wife, Sarah, had passed from cancer 6 months earlier. And those trees, God, they were everything to me. Their canopy of green gave me a place to drink my morning coffee while remembering her laugh dancing through the branches. She adored trees, always said they were proof that beauty could grow tougher after surviving storms. The house was sold to me by none other than Constance Peton herself, blonde, 48, and armed with that pushy suburban charisma that practically shouted, "I'm the boss around here." She drove a pearl-white Escalade with a blessed plate frame and slipped in casually that she also ran the HOA. She told me it was just a formality. Barely any rules, she assured. That should have been my first red flag. The second came at my very first HOA meeting. Constance ran it like a Fortune 500 boardroom presentation, complete with PowerPoint slides about optimizing property values and community aesthetic standards. I sat there in disbelief as she shut down a 70-year-old veteran who wanted nothing more than to plant a memorial garden for his fallen son. "Not in keeping with our vision," she declared, slamming her gavel like a judge. But the real warning sign? The way she kept stealing glances at my oaks through the community center windows, calculating, scheming, as if those trees were already hers. The first friendly visit came 6 weeks later. She showed up at my front door in designer tennis whites that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. Clipboard in hand, perfume so heavy it burned the back of my throat. "Garrett, honey," she started, heels tapping my porch like a countdown to trouble. "We need to talk about your trees." Apparently, several of my lakefront neighbors had concerns. Their million-dollar views of the water were compromised by the oak canopy. I glanced past her toward the artificial lake. 3 mega houses sat across the shore, each worth around $800,000, each enjoying pristine sightlines, if not for my trees. "The oaks were here when I bought the property," I reminded her. "From you, if I recall correctly." Her smile didn't falter, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "Oh, absolutely. But you know how these things evolve. Property values, community standards. I'm sure we can find a solution that works for everyone." That was my introduction to what I call constant speak, where everyone meant her and solution meant you lose. Over the next 18 months, she escalated like a bully straight out of a textbook. First, her little suggestions during evening power walks, always pausing at my property line to point out overgrowth or maintenance concerns. Then came formal violation notices, grass height, mailbox position, even the color of my welcome mat, each one slapped with $50 daily fines. Each appeal forced me to sit in front of her hand-picked board of timid retirees who could barely make eye contact as they voted against me. The message was loud and clear: comply or bleed money. But here's what Constance didn't know about electrical engineers. We're problem solvers, and we keep meticulous records. While she was busy playing neighborhood dictator, I was digging. I researched property law, pulled original subdivision plats, documented every encounter. Night after night, under those threatened oaks, I sat with my laptop balanced on my knees, not just defending my trees, but piecing together how much real power Constance actually had. The answer? A lot less than she believed. And then came her first fatal mistake. She hired a bogus arborist to declare my perfectly healthy 40-year-old oaks imminently dangerous. That's when I realized her empire was built on fraud, and it was about to collapse. The so-called arborist wasn't even certified for safety assessments. His report? Legally worthless. But as I kept digging into Constance's background, I found something far bigger than tree fraud. Something that flipped the roles, turning her from predator into prey. And something that would transform my quiet retirement into the most expensive lesson she'd ever face. Because those lakefront neighbors she was so desperate to please, they were about to learn their beloved HOA president had been lying to them about a whole lot more than just my oaks. Her revenge came swift and theatrical. 2 weeks after her arborist scam fell apart, she showed up at my door, a thick manila folder clutched clenched against her chest like it was holy scripture, that predatory smile stretching across her face. "Garrett, honey, I have wonderful news," she purred, her perfume so heavy it stung my eyes. "The newly formed Millbrook Estates Emergency Safety Committee had," she claimed, "completed a thorough review of my dangerous trees. I'd never even heard of such a committee." "Oh yes," she said, savoring every word. "Very official. Mrs. Henderson, the Johnsons, and myself. We've determined your trees pose an imminent threat." She thrust the folder at me like she was serving a warrant. Inside, grainy photos of my oaks during February's ice storm, their branches sagging under frozen weight, each shot framed like a crime scene, meant to make 40-year-old, perfectly healthy trees look like widowmakers. The report demanded immediate removal to prevent catastrophic damage and potential loss of life. The audacity was breathtaking, but Constance had made a fatal misstep. Back in my engineering career, I dealt with enough contractors to know one ironclad rule: emergency tree assessments require certified arborists, real ones. So while she stood there radiating smugness, I was already engineering my counterattack. That night, I pulled up the state licensing database, a tool I'd gotten familiar with during my divorce when Sarah's oncologist turned out to have questionable credentials. And there it was. Her expert arborist license had been suspended 3 months earlier for falsifying safety reports. The state board had an entire file on his pattern of fraudulent assessments. Even better, I remembered something from an old workplace harassment case. Ohio was a one-party consent state, which meant every conversation I'd secretly recorded with Constance, her admitting the real motivation behind all this, those lakefront views, was airtight, admissible evidence. The very next morning, I called City Inspector Rodriguez directly. When he arrived, a weathered man who clearly knew the difference between a hazard and a healthy oak, I laid everything out: the arborist's licensing violations, the fraudulent reports, and finally, a few choice recordings of Constance incriminating herself in her own syrupy voice. Rodriguez paced my property with a GPS unit in hand, measuring distances, checking soil conditions. The crunch of dead leaves under his boots mixed with his muttered Spanish curses as the realization hit him. He'd been dragged into an HOA scam. "Mr. Blackwood," he finally said, face tight with anger, "these are specimen trees, excellent health. Someone wasted city resources with fraudulent reports." I asked if he could document it officially. He was already scribbling. "Complaint dismissed with prejudice. And tell your HOA president that filing another false emergency report could carry criminal charges." That was my green light. Constance thought she'd cornered me. Instead, I went nuclear. I filed detailed complaints: state licensing board, city inspector's office, county prosecutor. But the real bombshell came when I chased a nagging question: where exactly did my property lines fall? The original 1987 subdivision plat told a fascinating story. My corner lot extended 15 feet further toward the lake than today's survey stake suggested. Somewhere over the decades, boundary markers had been shifted quietly, deliberately. My land was being used by neighbors for decorative gardens and dock access. I knew the principle well. I'd stumbled across it during my father's estate settlement. Original subdivision plats always trump later surveys. Deed descriptions are gospel, even when the physical markers lie. When I confronted Mrs. Henderson with the evidence, her face drained of color. "Garrett, I need to confess something," she whispered, eyes darting around like she expected Constance to appear. "She told us you planned to remove the trees anyway for insurance money. She said if we didn't sign her petition, declining property values would wreck our retirement savings." I pressed her. She caved further. "There's more. She's done this before. Remember the Williams on Elm Street? Constance forced them to cut down a healthy maple that blocked someone's lake view. They sold their house rather than keep fighting her. That night, I sat beneath my threatened oaks, legal pad balanced on my knee, listening to lake water lap against docks I now suspected were illegally placed. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Constance wasn't just targeting trees. She was orchestrating a systematic property manipulation scheme. But the most devastating revelation came when I decided to investigate the most obvious question of all. If she cared so much about boundaries and sight lines, what about her own mansion? 3 days later, the records I uncovered made my hands shake with adrenaline. Constance's gleaming lakefront estate, the jewel she was desperate to protect, was never supposed to exist as a private residence. According to the original developer's bankruptcy filings, her entire lot was designated as community green space. Every violation carried a $50 per day fine. Do the math, $250 bleeding from my account every single day until I bowed to her petty tyranny. 30 days before they filed a lien on my home, I stood on the porch, violation papers shaking in my hand, while the scent of honeysuckle drifted from Sarah's memorial garden. That sweet fragrance, once calming, now stoked my fury. Constance wasn't just needling me. She was trying to financially bleed me into submission. And she'd made a critical mistake. She gave me a paper trail. That afternoon, I marched into the county courthouse. Every corporate filing for Millbrook Estates HOA, I demanded. The clerk, tired eyes, ink-stained fingers, slid me a thin folder. Far too thin. A folder that should have have been fat with annual reports and compliance paperwork. I opened it and my pulse surged. Millbrook Estates HOA had let their Ohio nonprofit status expire 18 months ago. They missed the renewal deadline and never refiled. By state law, something I knew well from a consulting nightmare years back, expired corporations lose all authority. No power to collect fees, levy fines, or enforce contracts. Constance's HOA wasn't just overreaching. It was a ghost corporation. Every violation, every fine, every threat for over a year was legally worthless. And then it got better, much better. The HOA's checking account. It wasn't even registered to the association. Every homeowner's dues check for the past 24 months had been funneled into Peton Properties LLC, Constance's personal real estate business. $250,000. Community funds siphoned into her pocket. I wasn't just looking at harassment. I was staring straight at systematic embezzlement. I dialed the Ohio Attorney General's fraud hotline. The investigator answered on the second ring. I laid it out. Expired corporate status, diverted funds, false enforcement. Mr. Blackwood, he said, voice sharp with interest. Are you alleging theft of over $200,000 in homeowner dues? I flipped through the bank records I'd pulled via a public information request, adrenaline pumping. That's just the beginning. She wasn't just stealing our money. She was using it to fabricate evidence. Fraudulent expert reports, fake violation enforcement. While compiling my evidence package, I dug deeper into Constance's past. What I uncovered made my hands tremble with rage. This wasn't her first scam. 2 neighborhoods before Millbrook had already been gutted by her playbook. Families bankrupted by escalating HOA fines, forced into selling their homes at rock-bottom prices. Every foreclosure, every forced sale, handled exclusively by Peton Properties. Constance wasn't just a tyrant. She was running a property theft ring, disguised as community governance. The smoking gun wasn't even hidden. She had practically confessed on Facebook. Photos of century-old oaks being cut down, captions bragging about improved sight lines and better property values, comment threads celebrating the removal of unsightly obstacles. She'd left a breadcrumb trail of conspiracy, documented in her own words. I called an emergency meeting with the 3 rational board members, the ones who'd refused to rubber stamp her last tree removal vote. We met in Henderson's living room. The aroma of fresh coffee couldn't disguise the tension. I laid it all out. Expired corporate filings, bank statements proving embezzlement, documented patterns of forced sales. Their faces shifted in unison, shock, disbelief, then fury. She's been stealing from us for 2 years. Johnson spat, his voice breaking with rage. Worse, I added, she's been using our own money to manufacture fake emergencies, fake violations, fake crises. Henderson rose abruptly, walking to the window. Outside, Constance's mansion gleamed in the afternoon sun. No wonder she insisted on handling the finances herself, Henderson whispered. We thought she was being generous with her time. She was being generous with our money. 2 nights later, Constance struck back. She called her own emergency board meeting, this time bringing muscle. Her husband, Councilman Richard Peton. The community center's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps. Neighbors filed in, sensing the storm. Ladies and gentlemen, Constance declared, her voice echoing with practiced authority. Mr. Blackwood's reckless defiance threatens every one of your property values. I'm calling for an immediate vote, emergency tree removal, and expedited lien proceedings. That was my cue. I stood, folder in hand, every eye in the room locking on me. Before any vote, I said, voice steady, this community deserves the truth. Our HOA has been operating illegally for 18 months. Every fine collected, every penalty imposed, every threat issued. Criminal fraud. The room erupted. Shouts, gasps, neighbors turning on one another in chaos. But Constance wasn't finished. She sat frozen for 3 seconds, calculating. Then she smiled. Not her polished politician's smile. A cold, razor-thin smile that told me she'd been preparing for this moment. Well, she said smoothly, standing, adjusting her designer blazer. It seems Mr. Blackwood has done his homework, but research doesn't protect anyone from safety hazards. She pulled out her phone and dialed right there, in front of everyone. Yes, she said, voice chillingly casual. This is Constance Peton. We have that tree emergency we discussed. Tomorrow morning. Yes, the property owner will be traveling. My stomach dropped. My blood turned to ice. She had been watching my social media. Emma's college graduation. The drive to Cleveland. She knew I'd be gone. 8 perfect hours. She ended the call, then turned back to the room, her voice dripping with false concern. Ladies and gentlemen, for the safety of our children and families, the removal will proceed immediately. Emergency tree removal will commence tomorrow at 7 a.m., Constance declared. We have a legitimate safety crisis that supersedes any administrative irregularities Mr. Blackwood has raised. The room exploded into chaos. Henderson leapt to his feet, shouting about the illegality of an expired corporation. Johnson demanded to see permits, waving his arms in fury. But Constance wasn't listening. She was already striding out with her husband, phone pressed to her ear, making more calls. I followed them into the parking lot. Sodium streetlights bathed everything in a sickly yellow glow. The humid summer air smelled of rain. Constance, you can't authorize tree removal on my property. You have no legal authority. She turned, and for the first time I saw the real woman behind the suburban mask. Her eyes were as cold as a frozen lake. "Watch me," she said flatly, before climbing into her Escalade. That night, I barely slept. At 5 a.m., I made the hardest call of my life, phoning in sick to Emma's graduation. It was the first milestone of my children's I'd ever missed. But I couldn't leave. Instead, I stationed myself at my bedroom window, camera in hand. At exactly 6:47 a.m., the convoy rolled in, 2 pickup trucks, a wood chipper, and a county sheriff's cruiser. The crew looked professional, hard hats, safety vests, steel-toed boots. Chainsaws dangled at their sides. But something about the whole setup felt wrong. I threw on clothes and ran outside just as the saws roared to life. "Stop. These are my trees, on my property." The foreman, a weathered man with tobacco-stained teeth, frowned at me. "Ma'am said this was emergency removal. Got the paperwork right here." He handed me a work order, signed by Constance Peton, Emergency Safety Coordinator, Millbrook Estates. The letter looked official, but I knew better. I'd seen the same logo on the expired corporate filings. It was legally meaningless. "This woman has no authority to authorize anything," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "She's not even running a legal HOA." That's when Deputy Martinez stepped forward. Stocky, nervous, eyes flicking constantly toward Constance's mansion like he was waiting for a signal. "Sir," he said stiffly, "I'm here to supervise a legitimate safety operation. The city inspector signed off on this removal." "What city inspector?" I demanded. Martinez fumbled with the stack of papers in his hands, his face tightening. Inspector Rodriguez. He signed the emergency authorization yesterday. But I'd spoken with Rodriguez 2 weeks ago. He'd been crystal clear. These trees are healthy. Any emergency claim would be fraudulent. Someone was lying, and I had a recording to prove it. While I argued with the deputy, the chainsaws roared to life. Steel bit into 40-year-old oak, the sound reverberating like screams through the humid morning air. Diesel smoke from the chipper mixed with the rasp of my own panicked breathing. In 27 minutes, 6 magnificent oaks were gone. 6 giants that had shaded my home since the 1980s, including the one Sarah had carved her initials into. Our tree, the place I proposed, where she told me about her cancer, where I'd scattered her ashes. Gone, shredded into mulch. But here's the twist that changed everything. They didn't stop at the property line. In their frenzy to finish before I could get an injunction, the crew felled trees 15 feet inside my surveyed boundary. No dispute, no gray area. These were unquestionably mine. Deputy Martinez's face went pale the moment I pointed at the survey stakes. His hand froze on his radio. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, realizing he had just supervised the criminal destruction of private property. The foreman looked like he'd swallowed poison. "Ma'am said everything on this side of the driveway," he stammered. "Didn't mention no property lines." I stood there in the wreckage, sawdust hanging thick in the air, $89,000 worth of mature oak reduced to splintered stumps. The sweet, heavy scent of fresh cut wood clung to me, mixed with diesel fumes and the acrid taste of rage in my throat. But beneath the grief, one thought crystallized, sharp and undeniable. Constance had just committed multiple felonies in front of witnesses. Criminal trespass, destruction of property, fraud, conspiracy, enough to dismantle her entire empire. She'd wanted to erase my trees to improve her view. Now she'd given me the ammunition to take everything she owned, including, as I would soon discover, property that wasn't legally hers at all. By 8:30 a.m., the devastation was complete. 6 ancient oaks reduced to stumps. My yard a war zone. Deputy Martinez pacing nervously, wondering how he'd explain this in his report. I was still photographing the carnage when my phone buzzed. My attorney, Marcus Bennett, sharp, ruthless, a specialist in property rights cases. His voice carried that electric edge lawyers get when they smell blood in the water. "Garrett," he said, "you're not going to believe what I just found in the subdivision records." "Are you sitting down?" Marcus asked. I glanced around at the sawdust coating my lawn, my porch, my life. "Marcus, after this morning, nothing can shock me. Constance's lakefront property," he said, his tone slow, deliberate, "was never supposed to be privately owned." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What are you talking about?" "According to the original 1987 development plan, her entire lot, house, dock, everything, sits on land designated as community green space." I staggered back, my mind spinning. He went on. "Millbrook Construction went bankrupt in '89 before filing the final subdivision amendments. Constance's deed, based on preliminary plats that were never legally recorded. Technically, her property belongs to the homeowners association." I sank onto the porch steps, my hands trembling. "But she's been living there for 6 years. How is that even possible?" Marcus's voice tightened with grim satisfaction. "It gets better. I found bankruptcy court records showing Constance knew about the defect when she bought it. She paid the developer's attorney $15,000 to bury the conflicting documents and push through a fraudulent deed transfer. The pieces clicked together with brutal clarity. That's why she'd been so ruthless with the HOA. Why she micromanaged every land use issue. Why she kept original development documents locked down. She wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was protecting herself." "Exactly," Marcus said. "And here's the kicker. Her real estate license legally requires disclosure of any known title defects. She's been selling homes in this neighborhood while knowingly occupying stolen land. The state licensing board won't just suspend her, they'll crucify her. I stood, staring across the wreckage of my yard, past the splintered stumps of my oaks, to Constance's gleaming mansion. The rising sun flashed off her lakefront windows like a spotlight aimed straight at her guilt. "Marcus," I said quietly, "what's that property worth? Conservative estimate? 850,000, 600,000 in lakefront alone." My 6 destroyed oaks suddenly felt like kindling compared to what was at stake. "So when we sue for tree damages," Marcus continued, his voice brimming with sharp anticipation, "we're not just suing for trees anymore. We're demanding reversion of illegally privatized community property." This just went from small claims to federal court. I thought about every neighbor Constance had bullied, every family she'd driven out, every so-called rule she'd enforced with an iron fist. She hadn't been a watchdog for property values. She'd been a thief guarding stolen land. "And there's more," Marcus added. I pulled financial records. "She's been funneling HOA funds into her private upkeep, landscaping, dock repairs, even maintenance of her lake access driveway. All of it paid with community money. Garrett, we're not just looking at fraud anymore. We're staring down a systematic conspiracy to defraud an entire neighborhood." The sweet smell of sawdust clung to the air, mingling with the faint scent of lake water, the same lake Constance had been stealing for 6 years. Every sunset she'd admired from her fraudulent dock, every dinner she'd hosted on her stolen deck, every HOA check she'd collected while living on land that was never hers, all of it had been built on lies. "What's our next move?" I asked. Marcus didn't hesitate. "We hit her from every angle. Tree damages, property reversion, criminal referrals, state licensing complaints. By the time we're finished, Constance won't just lose the house. She'll lose everything." I stared at the wreckage around me with new eyes. Those oaks had been my living memorial to Sarah, but their destruction had become something more, the trigger that would unravel Constance's empire. She had bet her fortune on one reckless chainsaw spree, and now she was about to learn the truth, that some gambles don't just ruin lives. They obliterate the gambler. "How long do you think she's known this day would come?" I asked quietly. Marcus exhaled. "Judging by her recent behavior, she's been preparing an escape route for months. But it's too late now. She just turned a civil fraud into multiple felonies. There's no running from this." Within 48 hours of the massacre, my quiet retirement home had transformed into a legal war room. Marcus Bennett arrived Tuesday morning with 2 associates, armed with a forensic accountant and enough documentation to wallpaper my living room. "Garrett," Marcus said, spreading color-coded files across my dining table, "we're not just building a case anymore. We're dismantling a criminal enterprise that's been operating in plain sight for 6 years." The forensic accountant, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa Rodriguez, had spent the weekend tearing through the HOA's financials. What she uncovered made my stomach twist. "Your neighbor diverted $347,000 in community funds into her private businesses," Lisa announced, her fingers sliding across a spreadsheet that looked like a prosecutor's closing argument. "Landscaping contracts funneled into companies she secretly owns. Maintenance services billed but never performed. And my favorite, $23,000 in emergency legal fees that went directly to her divorce attorney." I shook my head, floored by the brazenness. "And that's not all," Marcus said, gesturing toward another associate. "Enter Janet Morrison, an environmental lawyer with the calm voice of someone who'd spent her life turning tree stumps into dollar signs." "Yes," Marcus added with a wry smile, "tree law is real." Janet laid out her findings like evidence at trial. 6 mature white oaks with 40 years of growth. Replacement value, $89,000. She slid photographs across the table that made my trees look less like yard ornaments and more like sacred relics. "But that's only the beginning," she continued, pulling out soil analysis reports marked in red. "Removing those established root systems destabilized your slope drainage. You're looking at potential erosion damage, foundation risks for neighboring homes, and long-term ecological disruption. Decades of restoration work, easily 6 figures in damages." And then came the real shock. Marcus introduced the third attorney, a wiry, no-nonsense man with the demeanor of a federal agent. His specialty? RICO, the very same racketeering laws once used to dismantle organized crime families. Apparently, Constance's web of fraud, embezzlement, falsified deeds, systematic misuse of HOA funds qualified as organized criminal activity. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the mountain of evidence stacked against her. Constance hadn't just chopped down my trees. She'd cut down her own future. A clear pattern of behavior stretched across multiple victims. Financial fraud surpassing federal thresholds. Conspiracy entangling public officials. Marcus recited it like a prosecutor preparing an indictment. "Your HOA president isn't just a neighborhood bully," he said. "She's running a property theft syndicate." While the legal team sharpened the case, I focused on mobilizing the community. Word of Constance's illegal tree cutting had spread through Millbrook Estates like a brush fire, and my phone hadn't stopped ringing. Henderson was first. Garrett, I dug into my HOA files. Constance overcharged us $8,000 for community center repairs that were never finished. Then Johnson called. She forced me to remove a garden shed for being non-compliant. 2 months later, her landscaping company installed the same shed at her house, paid for with HOA funds. By Thursday, 7 families had stepped forward with identical stories. Harassment, bogus violations, escalating fines, threats of liens, forced compliance, all engineered to funnel money and benefits back to Constance or her circle. The smoking gun came Friday evening from an unlikely source. Carol Martinez, wife of Deputy Martinez, called me, her voice trembling with fury. Mr. Blackwood, my husband came home sick after that tree cutting. Constance told him the emergency authorization came from the city, but when he checked with his supervisor, there was no record of any order. Your husband was lied to, I said. It's worse, Carol replied. She handed him $500 cash to supervise the removal and told him not to ask questions. He thought it was legit over time, until he realized what really happened. That was it, direct evidence of bribing a law enforcement officer. Marcus spent the weekend coordinating our strike. Criminal referrals to the county prosecutor and state attorney general. Civil lawsuits in both state and federal court. Professional complaints targeting her real estate license and her husband's city council seat. The key is timing, Marcus explained, spreading a military-style timeline across my dining table. We drop everything at once. Criminal, civil, administrative. She won't have time to move assets or invent counter-evidence. But the most devastating blow would come from the community itself. Ohio law allowed homeowners to reclaim illegally privatized land through a majority vote, and now we had documents proving Constance's prized lakefront belonged to us. Picture the irony, Marcus said, a grin breaking across his face. She cut down your trees to improve her view. We're going to use that crime to take away her entire lake. The final revelation came when Janet Morrison's environmental assessment uncovered something staggering. The plot where my memorial trees once stood was designated as a protected wetland buffer in the original plan. This isn't just property destruction, Janet explained, flipping through EPA reports. It's an environmental crime under federal jurisdiction. Constance hadn't just improved her sightline. She had triggered the Clean Water Act with violations that could rack up another $200,000 in penalties. By Sunday night, our arsenal was complete. Criminal evidence, civil claims worth $1.4 million, and airtight proof of the largest property fraud in county history. The smell of strong coffee mingled with the sharper scent of justice. Constance had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood. Now she was about to learn what happens when the neighborhood fights back, with professionals, evidence, and a bottomless reservoir of resolve. Her panic showed immediately. Monday morning, I watched a moving truck rumble up to her lakefront mansion. By noon, a for sale sign stabbed into her perfect lawn. She was trying to liquidate before the courts froze her assets. But Marcus had anticipated her escape. By 2 p.m., we secured an emergency restraining order halting all property transfers pending investigation. The walls were closing in, and this time there was no way out. The look on Constance's face when the sheriff handed her those papers was worth every sleepless night I had endured. But that evening, instead of retreating, she made her first critical mistake. She went on the offensive, launching a social media campaign that looked like it had been crafted by a desperate politician. I'm being targeted by a vindictive neighbor who refuses to respect community standards, she posted in the neighborhood Facebook group, complete with carefully cropped photos of my unkempt yard. Mr. Blackwood has filed frivolous lawsuits to avoid paying legitimate HOA fines. Her plan backfired instantly. Within hours, neighbors flooded the thread with their own Constance horror stories. The Hendersons shared documentation of $3,000 in bogus fines. The Johnsons posted photographs proving they had paid twice for landscaping, once through HOA dues, and again when Constance claimed the original work was non-compliant. By Wednesday, 17 families had officially joined our class action lawsuit. But Constance's next move didn't just cross a line, it detonated it. She attempted to bribe City Inspector Rodriguez, offering him $2,000 to backdate an emergency tree removal authorization. Unfortunately for her, Rodriguez, still furious about being dragged into her fraudulent scheme, was wearing a wire. The recording was damning. Constance's voice rang out, clear as a bell, as she offered cash in exchange for falsified government documents. Marcus played the tape for me over coffee that tasted like pure victory. I need you to sign this emergency authorization and predate it to last Friday, her recorded voice demanded. $2,000 cash, and we can both pretend this paperwork got lost in the shuffle. Rodriguez's response was perfect. Ma'am, you're asking me to commit a felony. I'm asking you to be reasonable about a simple administrative oversight. The FBI fraud division didn't just like the recording, they loved it. That single conversation elevated her crimes from state misdemeanors to federal felonies, the kind that carried real prison sentences. Meanwhile, I was waging a different battle. Constance had somehow convinced 3 neighbors to sign sworn affidavits affidavits claiming my trees had been dangerous and that she had acted heroically to protect community safety. The affidavits were laughably identical. Same phrasing, same suspiciously detailed accounts. But my military training had taught me one thing: always verify your intelligence. A little digging exposed the truth. All three witnesses had recently received emergency property tax reductions, expedited through her husband's city council connections. Each family had saved thousands right before signing their statements in her defense. That single discovery gave us proof of conspiracy and official misconduct, and now a sitting city councilman was implicated. But Thursday, Constance made her boldest and most reckless play yet. She filed a countersuit against me, accusing me of harassment, threats, and waging a malicious campaign of character assassination. She demanded $500,000 in damages for emotional distress and defamation. Her fatal error? Including specific dates and incidents I could easily disprove. She claimed I had made threatening phone calls on days when my phone records showed I was in Cleveland visiting my daughter. She accused me of property vandalism during times when my own security cameras proved I hadn't even stepped outside. Marcus actually laughed out loud while reviewing her countersuit. Garrett, she just handed us evidence of perjury. Filing false claims in federal court? That's another felony charge. The FBI fraud division didn't just like the recording, they loved it. That single conversation elevated her crimes from state misdemeanors to federal felonies, the kind that carried real prison sentences. Meanwhile, I was waging a different battle. Constance had somehow convinced 3 neighbors to sign sworn affidavits claiming my trees had been dangerous and that she had acted heroically to protect community safety. The affidavits were laughably identical. Same phrasing, same suspiciously detailed accounts. But my military training had taught me one thing: always verify your intelligence. A little digging exposed the truth. All 3 witnesses had recently received emergency property tax reductions, expedited through her husband's city council connections. Each family had saved thousands right before signing their statements in her defense. That single discovery gave us proof of conspiracy and official misconduct, and now a sitting city councilman was implicated. But Thursday, Constance made her boldest and most reckless play yet. She filed a countersuit against me, accusing me of harassment, threats, and waging a malicious campaign of character assassination. She demanded $500,000 in damages for emotional distress and defamation. Her fatal error? Including specific dates and incidents I could easily disprove. She claimed I had made threatening phone calls on days when my phone records showed I was in Cleveland visiting my daughter. She accused me of property vandalism during times when my own security cameras proved I hadn't even stepped outside. Marcus actually laughed out loud while reviewing her countersuit. Garrett, she just handed us evidence of perjury. Filing false claims in federal court? That's another felony charge. The community's reaction was nothing short of overwhelming. Neighbors organized meal trains for my family. Volunteer crews showed up with tools and soil to help restore the yard Constance had destroyed. A legal defense fund raised $12,000 in just 3 days. But the most powerful support came from someone I never expected: Carol Martinez, the deputy's wife. She spearheaded a petition demanding Constance's immediate removal from the HOA board. Within 48 hours, she had gathered signatures from 41 of the 47 families. "We're tired of living under a dictatorship," Carol declared at an impromptu community meeting held in the flickering light of the recreation hall. The fluorescent bulbs hummed above us like a nest of angry wasps as she read name after name of families who had been fined, bullied, or terrorized by Constance's reign. Then Mrs. Henderson rose to her feet, her voice trembling with rage. "She's stolen our money, destroyed our neighbor's property, and turned this neighborhood into a war zone. Enough is enough." By Friday evening, the walls were collapsing in on Constance from every direction. Federal fraud investigators had frozen her bank accounts. The state licensing board suspended her real estate credentials. Her husband faced ethics charges that promised to end his political career. But Constance wasn't done. Saturday morning, she made one last desperate move. She called an emergency HOA meeting for Sunday afternoon, citing urgent community business. The agenda promised a final resolution of ongoing disputes and major financial decisions. I knew she was plotting something catastrophic. What I didn't know was that she was about to confess, live, in front of 50 witnesses and a Facebook stream. That night, sleep was impossible. The emergency meeting felt like a trap, but I couldn't put my finger on how. At 3 in the morning, pacing my kitchen in the dim light, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "She's planning to dissolve the HOA tomorrow and file for bankruptcy protection. Thought you should know. A friend." My blood turned to ice. If Constance dissolved the homeowners association, she might wriggle out of liability for the embezzled funds and fraud. Worse, without an HOA, our property reversion claim would be left hanging. No entity left to receive the stolen land. I called Marcus immediately, ignoring the hour. His voice was groggy but sharp. "She can't dissolve an HOA on her own. It requires a majority homeowner vote and state approval. But if she's desperate, she might try to ram ram it through. And if she succeeds? I asked. Then we're fighting a whole different war. Sunday morning brought an ally I hadn't expected. Deputy Martinez showed up at my front door, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His uniform was rumpled, his eyes heavy. He took a shaky breath. "Mr. Blackwood," he began, "I need to tell you something before that meeting. My wife says I should have spoken up sooner. Constance had once offered me money to look the other way during the tree cutting. At the time, I thought it was just overtime pay for supervising a safety operation." "You took the money?" I asked Deputy Martinez. "No, sir," he said quietly. "But I didn't ask enough questions either. I let her manipulate me into enabling what I now know was a crime." He handed me an envelope, his sworn statement. Every detail of what she'd said, what she'd promised, and how she'd dressed her scheme in a veneer of legality. The emergency HOA meeting was set for 2 p.m., but by 1:30 the streets were jammed. Cars lined the road for 3 blocks. Word had spread beyond Millbrook Estates. The story of HOA corruption had caught fire, and local reporters were already setting up cameras at the entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The community center buzzed with whispers and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Constance sat at the head table in a severe black business suit, like she was presiding over a funeral, her own, though she didn't realize it yet. Richard, her husband, sat at her left, sweating through his shirt despite the air conditioning. 3 jittery board members filled out the panel. But the real shock sat quietly in the back row. FBI agent Sarah Bennett, taking notes in a government-issued notebook. Federal agents don't attend HOA meetings unless they're preparing an indictment. Constance banged the gavel with trembling hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, recent events have made it clear that continuing our homeowners association is no longer viable. I am calling for an immediate vote to dissolve Millbrook Estates HOA and distribute remaining assets to current homeowners." The room exploded. Mrs. Henderson was on her feet, shouting about stolen funds. Johnson demanded to know where the missing money had gone. But Constance bulldozed forward, clinging to parliamentary rules, trying to force a vote before objections could be properly lodged. That's when it hit me. Her plan wasn't about escape. It was about erasure. Dissolving the HOA meant erasing the legal entity that owned the records of her crimes. Without it, the paper trail of embezzlement and fraud could vanish into smoke. I rose from my chair, folder of evidence in hand. 47 sets of eyes shifted toward me. "Before we vote on dissolution," I said, "this community deserves to know exactly what it's dissolving." "You're out of order, Mr. Blackwood." Constance snapped, her mask slipping. "Actually, I'm perfectly in order," I countered. "As a homeowner in good standing, I have the right to present relevant information before any major vote." Agent Bennett looked up from her notes, watching intently now. "Ladies and gentlemen," I continued, my voice steady, "our HOA president has embezzled $347,000 in community funds, bribed government officials, and illegally occupied community land worth over $800,000. This motion to dissolve isn't about protecting you. It's about destroying the evidence of her federal crimes." Constance shot to her feet, her face crimson. "That's slander. I've devoted years of my life to this community." "Then explain," I said, my voice cutting through the room like glass, "why your lakefront property sits on land that was deeded as protected community green space." Silence fell. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The only sound was the deliberate scratch of Agent Bennett's pen across the page. "That's a misunderstanding of the original development plans," Constance stammered. "It's a misunderstanding that made you $850,000 richer," I shot back, "while stealing from your neighbors." Her husband, Richard, lurched to his feet, his chair scraping across the linoleum like fingernails on a chalkboard. "This meeting is over. We're leaving." But Constance wasn't finished. Rage boiled over her polished veneer, and in her fury, she made the fatal mistake I had been waiting for. "You people don't understand what I've done for this neighborhood," she screamed, her mask finally shattering. "I've improved property values, removed problem residents, and maintained standards that benefit everyone. If that required creative financing and strategic property management, then so be it." Every head turned. Agent Bennett stopped writing mid-sentence. Her eyes narrowed, the expression of someone who had just heard a full confession. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, whispers colliding into chaos. Constance blinked, realizing too late what she had admitted. In front of 50 witnesses, 2 reporters, and a federal investigator, her downfall had begun. By 2:15 p.m., the community center looked less like a neighborhood meeting and more like a trial. Standing room only didn't begin to cover it. People crammed into aisles, pressed against walls. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years now stood shoulder to shoulder, united by their shared fury. Local news crews lined cameras against the walls, lenses locked on Constance. And in the middle row, Agent Bennett now sat front and center, her federal badge catching the fluorescent light like a blade. The side door opened. Constance entered not as a leader, but as a defendant, trailed by a sweating attorney who looked like he hadn't even skimmed the case files. The confidence that once defined her was gone. Her eyes darted like a trapped animal. "This emergency meeting," she began, her voice cracking, "will address ongoing legal harassment and frivolous accusations. But the energy in the room was no longer hers to command. 47 neighbors stared her down, their voices finally unified. Mrs. Henderson rose first, her voice trembling but resolute. "Before you say another word, Constance, this community wants answers. Where's our money?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Her attorney leaned in, whispering frantically, but Constance shoved him aside, clinging to arrogance like a drowning woman clings to driftwood. "All HOA funds have been properly managed according to community needs," she insisted, flipping through shaking notes. "Any accounting irregularities are administrative oversights, matters that will be resolved through proper channels." That's when the real hammer dropped. From the back of the room, Marcus Bennett, no relation to Agent Bennett, stood. His briefcase clicked open, the sharp sound echoing like a gavel. "Mrs. Payton," he said, voice cold and deliberate, "would you care to explain the $347,000 in community funds deposited into your private business accounts? Or perhaps tell us why your lakefront mansion sits on land that was legally deeded as community green space?" The room went ice cold. All eyes bore down on her. Constance's face shifted in rapid succession: confusion, denial, then raw panic. "Those are privileged financial matters that have no bearing on." "Nothing's privileged about federal wire fraud," Agent Bennett cut in, her voice slicing through the air like steel. She rose from her chair, the weight of her badge radiating authority. "Mrs. Payton, you are not required to speak, but be advised, anything you say can and will be used against you in federal court." The crowd inhaled as one, a collective gasp that rattled the fluorescent lights. In the back, a phone lifted, then another. Within seconds, a dozen cameras locked in, hungry to capture what was about to become the most infamous HOA meeting in Ohio history. But Constance Payton wasn't ready to bow. 6 years of unchecked power had calcified into arrogance, and desperation only made her reckless. "This is a conspiracy," she shrieked, her finger jabbing the air, trembling as it leveled at me. "Garrett Blackwood orchestrated this entire circus because he can't accept legitimate community standards. I've protected property values, maintained neighborhood aesthetics, and ensured compliance with essential regulations." The room exploded. Johnson shot to his feet, his face flushed crimson with rage long suppressed. "You stole our money to pay for fake tree reports. You forced 3 families out of their homes." Henderson cried, her voice breaking. "You've been squatting on stolen community land for 6 years. Martinez barked, his deputies toned sharp and commanding. One after another, neighbors rose, accusations tumbling out like floodwaters breaking a dam: harassment, fraud, intimidation, extortion. The air vibrated with justice finally finding its voice. And then Constance struck the match that burned her entire empire to ash. "You people don't understand what real leadership requires," she screamed, her composure shattering like glass against concrete. "I've made hard decisions to protect this community's investment. If that meant removing problematic residents, restructuring financial arrangements, or strategically managing property usage, then I did what was necessary." The room froze. Not a cough, not a shuffle, just silence. Agent Bennett's pen slid across her notepad with deliberate precision, as though she were taking dictation in a confessional. Marcus leaned forward, his lawyer's instincts sharp as a blade. "Mrs. Payton, are you admitting to financial fraud and property theft?" Her attorney clamped a hand on her arm, whispering frantically in her ear. But it was useless. Constance had stepped so deep into her own delusion that legal advice meant nothing. 6 years of absolute control had convinced her that confessing wasn't losing. It was simply explaining leadership. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of what used to be Constance's stolen lakefront mansion, now repainted in bright community colors, its gates torn down forever. My grandchildren laughed in the sand where her illegal dock once stood, their voices carrying across the water like a hymn of freedom. The federal judge had awarded me $1.4 million in damages, the largest HOA fraud judgment in Ohio history. But that was just money. The true victory was watching neighbors once divided gather for barbecues, fishing tournaments, and summer movie nights on the lawn Constance had tried to steal. Constance herself had pled guilty to 14 federal counts. Her sentence: restitution, forfeiture, and the irony of teaching ethics to real estate professionals. Her husband, disgraced, resigned from city council, and the couple fled to Florida, a self-imposed exile where no one cared about their former status. And every evening, when the sun set across the lake, its light flashing against water she once claimed as her own, we were reminded that justice isn't just about punishment. Sometimes, it's about finally reclaiming the place you call home. But justice was only the beginning of our story. The reclaimed lakefront property became the beating heart of our community's rebirth. Where Constance's mansion once loomed, we raised the Sarah Blackwood Memorial Community Center, named after my late wife, a woman who would have cherished seeing neighbors united for something good. The center now hosts everything from children's art classes to senior bridge tournaments, all funded entirely by the recovered embezzlement money. My destroyed Memorial Grove returned as something even more meaningful. The community voted to create the Millbrook Heritage Arboretum, planting 40 new 2 trees, one for each family in our neighborhood. Every tree bears a plaque engraved with the family's name and a message of growth, resilience, and community. At the center stands Sarah's memorial oak, its brass plate reading, "In memory of love that grows stronger through seasons of storm." The impact spread far beyond our streets. Our case became required reading in law schools studying HOA fraud, and the Ohio legislature passed the Millbrook Act, mandating independent financial audits and background checks for HOA board members. Inspired by our victory, 3 other communities used our legal precedent to reclaim stolen common areas, recovering over $2 million in assets. For me, though, the most satisfying outcome was personal. My retirement, once shattered by Constance's harassment campaign, found unexpected meaning. With part of my settlement, we established the Millbrook Property Rights Education Foundation, offering free legal help to homeowners facing HOA abuse. 17 families have already fought back against fraudulent violations, recovering more than $300,000 in illegal fees. Last month, we hosted our first annual tree festival, celebrating both stewardship and solidarity. Families spread picnic blankets beneath the shade of the memorial grove. Children climbed on playgrounds where Constance's Escalade once stood like a weapon, and the air carried the scent of grilled burgers mingled with honeysuckle along our restored lakefront. Henderson, now our democratically elected HOA president, gave a speech about neighbors uniting against corruption. Johnson, as treasurer, presented the first transparent financial report our community had ever seen. Even Deputy Martinez, who testified at Constance's sentencing, joined with his family in celebration. The festival's highlight was presenting a scholarship to Emma Rodriguez, a local high school senior bound for Ohio State to study property law. Her essay on protecting community rights earned her $5,000 toward tuition and a summer internship with Marcus Bennett's law firm. As the sun dipped behind our reclaimed lake, casting the water in gold and crimson, I thought of Sarah, how proud she would have been of the beauty and strength that rose from our tragedy. Her carved initials in that first memorial oak had been erased by Constance's chainsaws, but Sarah's legacy lived on in every family picnic on community land, every child learning to swim in water that finally belonged to everyone, and every neighbor who felt safe in their own home again. That evening, we ended around a fire pit built on the exact spot where Constance once parked her Escalade like a weapon. Children's laughter carried across the lake while parents swapped stories about the old days when one woman's greed poisoned an entire neighborhood. But those days were gone for good. We'd learned that when defended together, individual property rights protect everyone. That documented truth defeats manufactured authority, and that communities are far stronger than they realize when they choose courage over compliance. Now it's your turn. Drop a comment with your worst HOA nightmare. You might be surprised how many legal options you actually have. And don't forget to subscribe if you want more stories about ordinary people taking down corrupt systems with smart legal strategies and community solidarity. Next week, I'll tell you about the homeowner who discovered his neighbor's perfect lawn was hiding a massive environmental crime, how one noise complaint turned into a $2.3 million EPA settlement that changed federal regulations. From all of us here at HOA Stories, thanks for watching this week's HOA Karen Meltdown. If you enjoyed seeing neighbors stand their ground and karma catch up, smash that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next HOA drama we bring you.